Guys, I'm coming back, mamish, in a second. Give me a second over here. Sorry about this. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Trumais, Pei Gimel, Halacha Beis, and Halacha Gimel. We're learning today Daf Chav Tes, starting Mamish on top of the Amid, and we are dedicating today's class Le'iloi Nishmas, my parents, Avimoidi Harav Mordechai ben Harav Simcha Yitzchak, whose yard site is today Yud Aleph Elul, and to separate from the living to the living, to my mother, may she be well, that she should live until Mashiach and have nachas from all of her family, children, and enaklach, etc. Amen. So, we are beginning to refer back to the halacha that we had in the Mishnah, and that is regarding workers. After the Mishnah established that if you're not a partner, that a worker has not only, obviously, there's no shlichus if the worker was not appointed by the balabas, but there isn't even a gilui das, there isn't any type of presumed consent that the balabas gave the worker permission for him to separate truma. Nevertheless, the Mishnah gave one exception. And what is that one exception? That the Mishnah calls them the deroichos, those who tread on grapes. I hope Gabriel comes online. That grape treaders, workers that were hired to produce wine, as we explained that the Mishnah is only speaking about a case where the owner is an Amaretz. And all of these workers that he hires are dafke chavedim, which means that we see that the owner is concerned. He wants for at least the truma separation to be tahor, as we'll get into a lot of details today. And part of what's needed is for him not to have contact with it. So it's presumed that he did give consent, that he gives automatic consent for these treaders, for them to separate truma, as we'll see a lot more in the Gemara. The Gemara first will begin to specify exactly at what point do the treaders separate truma. We're going to actually ultimately come to a three-way machloikas. And from there, we're going to go me'inyan le'inyan. What about when it comes to the workers that were hired to produce olive oil? Do we say the same? Do we not say the same? As we will see, a gavaldika nafkamina between making wine versus making oil vis-a-vis the concern of tuma, which is the basis for this presumed consent. And in halacha gimel in today's daf, we're going to establish two things. First of all, for one to designate truma, not only do you not have to physically separate it, but making just a designation in itself will be a proper hafrashas truma. The question will be, is a simple declaration enough? Or do you have to at least give some sort of specification vis-a-vis where from within the bowl, from within the pile, from within the keli, are you going to be later taking off the truma? And we're going to have in the Mishnah a four-way machloikis tanoim. That will be the first topic of the Mishnah. The second topic of the Mishnah will be is that there is a seder when it comes to the designation of all of the tithings, even beginning with bikurim. Bikurim first, then truma gedoyla, then meiser rishon, then trumas meiser, and then meiser sheni. And the question will be, what were to happen if someone went out of that seder? And as the Mishnah will say, that post facto, what you did is done. And this actually, if you remember that in Talmud, in the Lashon of the Babli, there's a whole machlekes whether kol milsa, the Amar Rachmana loy savit, I avad, mahani, or loy mahani, one of the sources that yes, mahani, in other words, even though God said not to do it, if you did it, it's effective. You know, over there we're speaking about, just as an example, a kohen marries a gerusha, not according to Rabbi Akiva, but according to the other Tanoim, even though he's not allowed to do it, the Kedushin is effective, mahani, right? By Yisur Kodesh do we say that the Kedushin is not even chal. And here we will have another example that even though you have to follow the right Seder, we're going to actually have in the Mishnah the source, the biblical source, and the lav for not being allowed to go out of the order. But if someone went out of the order, it's going to be effective. And let's dive right in. It's a loaded daf chav tes amud aleph, all the way on top of the Amid. Again, we are referring back to the case in Halacha Beis in the Mishnah, that even though normally you have to have at least a gilui das of consent, nevertheless, says the Mishnah, that hapoyalim, that workers that were hired to shred grapes to turn them into olive oil, ein lahem rishus. Normally, workers ein lahem rishus. Again, the words of the Mishnah is chutz min hadoroichos. Doroichos means shredders, people that trample. As we'll go into more details, how they used to make wine, that they actually have a presumption that they were given permission to separate them. Okay. So says the Gemara, and nach the Mishnah, nach words, that what, and I'm quoting the words, Rabbi Yochanan, clarifying the Mishnah, that that these treaders, once they walk on top of the grapes in one direction and in the other direction, so they walk north, south, and east, west. Really, they make many such walks to extract all of the juice from the grape. But once they only did this minimum amount of treading, which that minimum amount of treading produces a minimum amount of wine, so says Rabbi Yochanan, listen to this, mitamin es haboir miyad, that from that point and on, we have to regard all of the juice, all of the wine, as not actually tamei, even though he says the words tamei, it's actually into a suffix tuma, meaning that as soon as some of the liquid is extracted, what Rabbi Yochanan is really saying, this is the point where the workers, the chavedim, should then immediately separate truma. Why? So as we will unfold the sugya, we will see both the owner and even other people allowed themselves to wine tasting, whether that was necessary to see the quality, whether there's something they could do about it, or just the way it is. People would be touching the wine. Everyone understood that if an Amaretz touches the wine, it will become tummy. That's self-understood. No one was that concerned for the wine that's chulin, for it to become tamei. It was not a concern. These are amaratzim. What everyone wanted is that the truma separation, which will be gifted to the kohen, should be something from which the kohen can benefit from. So the truma separation has to remain in the state of tahara. Now we have to really understand a couple of dinim that we all learn together. We're going to put it all together. Number one, you're not allowed to separate wine for grapes, even though you're cheshboning, right, Aviv, you're calculating how much wine will the grapes produce. We've already had it in the Mishnah, because you're not allowed to separate from something that's already gemar malachid to another product that's not yet completed. So let's make it clear that when Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the shredder should separate some of the wine prior to people touching it, and people will begin touching it very early on, the owner and others, you walk across in one direction, and in the other direction, you have a little bit of wine, you separate it. That separation is not the normal separation of truma, because you can only declare that truma only after all of the wine is already wine, after all of the grapes were properly treaded, when everything is a finished product. Aleph. Beis, we also learned that you're not allowed to be, you cannot designate tahor and tamei. Rabbi Yochanan is going with the presumption, as we will see, actually backed up with a braisa, that the owner allows himself to begin touching and tasting the wine very early on. If you want to chaparain and separate it betaro, says Rabbi Yochanan, right away, shasi ve'erev, right away separate that liquid for truma. But what's really happening is like this, is that liquid is separated in another keli. It's actually not yet designated as truma. For that, you have to wait until everything is already trampled. Here there's a chiddush, that even though when everything is trampled, there is a halachic suffix that everything else is tamei, unlike that which was separated by the chavedim, that's still tahor. But since when that was separated in the beginning, there wasn't yet tuma, I know there wasn't yet wine because it was still unprocessed. The prohibition of separating min ha-tahor al ha-tamei does not apply here. That's a big chiddush. It's when you have two separate piles, tohid and tamei. That's where we learned in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to separate minat tohid ala tamei. We learned one of the reasons. Let's go that it's a midrabanan, that it's going to be minat mukav. You're going to put them together. We don't have to review what we learned already in Banat right now. But since you made the designation, this will be later designated for truma. That circumvents the issur of separating minat tohid ala tamei, because when you make that designation for what you will do in the future, then there was no tumah yet. So everything works out. So the workers have to right away take the little bit of liquid to be later declared as truma. They continue trampling, and there's already, from that moment on, halachically, there is a suffix tumah on all of the wine, and then a chanami, and the chulin will have a status of suffix tumah. But the advantage will be is that little, we also learned another detail before, it's in a bucket. You actually put the bucket inside the same vat, so you should have the lechatchila min hamukaf. Obviously, they're separated. As we explained, since it was designated before to be declared as truma, there is no isur in this case, min hatoyed al hatuma, and then they make the declaration. Okay. In other words, all of this is clarifying our Mishnah, that when the Mishnah says that there is an automatic presumption that workers, that are treaders, are allowed to separate truma, when do they do it? The earliest time possible. So says Rabbi Yechanan, I learned in Abraisa that hapoyalin shetormu es haboid, that if workers separate wine from the vat without having permission, the Braisa says normally ain trumas and truma, without expressed consent, or even better shlichus, what they did is not valid. There is an exception in the Braisa, the im hoya habor koten, only if the vat is very small. When a vat is very small, this Braisa understands that not only is there an issue of whether did the owner allow himself to taste wine or to touch the wine or to touch the contents. When the vat was small, passerbys, that was the norm. They allowed themselves also to touch everything in the vat. So now you are concerned not only with one owner, but you are concerned with many more people. Or not only if the vat is small, but even if the vat is big. But it's known that in this wine factory, everybody is allowed to be mamashchech, to start stirring and touching and tasting, wine tasters. Only over there is there a presumed authority, trumas and truma. In other words, says the Gemara, that mipnei sha'achede mimashmechen bohem, that's why he has permission. That's what the Braisa says. If other people are not allowed in this wine factory to do wine tasting, ein truma san truma. So this l'chu'ura should be a stira with the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says the Mishnah does not differentiate between a little boy or between a big boy, between whether others are allowed in this wine factory to taste or not. But the Gemara is not asking against the Mishnah. The Gemara is asking this kasha against Rabbi Yochanan. So what will Rabbi Yochanan do with this Braisa? Now, why is this a kasha only on Rabbi Yochanan? Look inside the Maraful, who answers this question. Here, 10 lines from the top, right? Now, since the Braisa says the words poyalim, mashma afilu oisam shaholchumam shasi ve'erev, once they begin to tread, they are already called poyalim. So without the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, maybe we're speaking about other workers. But now that Rabbi Yochanan established that once they begin doing any type of work, the people that begin to tread, which are included in the din of poyalim, that they should right away separate truma. And our Mishnah does not differentiate big or small. Our Mishnah does not differentiate whether other people are allowed to do wine tasting or not. And Rabbi Yochanan is making a blatant statement. And it sounds from Rabbi Yochanan that no matter when workers, chavedim, the moment there's a little bit of liquid, they should right away separate without even getting the shus, because afterwards there is going to be a suffix tuma. So the Gemara says, Gavaldik, you're confusing the Braisa and the Mishnah. because the Mishnah is speaking about winemaking, kan biyayin, and indeed by all winemakers, when the owner is an Amaretz and he hires chavedim for workers, they are automatically authorized, and they should do it right away as soon as there's a little bit of liquid. However, the Braisa is speaking about oil. And what's the difference? Like the Gemara of Aloihu Yain, Hushemin, are they not the same? Why are they different? And the Gemara answers over here, Yayin tu masay mitsuya. There's a much of a greater chance that wine will become tamei. By oil, shemen ain't tu masay mitsuya. Why? And here for Gabriel, it's common for there to be wine tasters. Until today, we heard that expression. Some people over here in Mastama did that. And it was accepted. Oil, unless there are unique type of people that are tasting olive oil, which is what the Braisa is saying, that if you know that the arachedim mimachshechen, then the workers also have automatic authority, they have automatic consent, unless you know that, or unless the vat is so little, so it makes it easy for people to touch the oil. Other than that, then most people don't taste the oil. They're not going to do that. So a very simple approach. Now you have to remember this for what we're going to learn later today. According to this understanding, that the automatic presumed consent is dafka for winemakers, and we don't apply it to oil makers. We mentioned, I think it was not yesterday, that we don't make a bracha on olive oil because the Gemara says that it's mazik. Unlike wine, wine is a marape, especially in moderation. It's healthy, a little bit of wine. But culturally, definitely, wine tasters, oil tasters, let's say, is a lot less prevalent, even today. Okay, so now that we spoke about this concept, that when you make wine, since people will taste the wine, the owner and others, the worker should separate truma ASAP. And Rabbi Yochanan says the ASAP is from Shesiva Erev, which means once they did the minimum amount of treading, which produces the oil that will become later the approximate 2% once everything is treaded, really we're going to see that there's a lot about that. Says the Gemara. First of all, Tani, we learned in the Braisa that from when do you separate truma? We ask, this is like Rabbi Yochanan, and as we explained before, it's not that when you have that amount of liquid, it's actually declared as truma. You're not allowed to do that because you cannot separate wine for grapes, even if you make the right calculations. No, we're speaking about a unique, that you separate it in a different keli, and it's being designated now that later, when everything will be made into wine, this will be the truma designation. The truma designation has to happen again later, but it's being separated already now. Now, when do we presume that that there is truma? Halachically means, when do we have to treat it as something that is safek tameh? So here we have a whole variety of opinions, and ultimately we will see shitas chachamim, which is what Rabbi Yochanan relies on. So don't get nervous with Rabbi Yochanan. Opinion number one is Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says mishayoytzi es hasheni. In other words, from when will the owner allow himself to taste wine, or when others will take the liberty of doing some wine tasting only after the separation was made, not only of Truma Gedoyla, not only of Ma'aser Rishon. Don't forget, guys, Ma'aser Rishon in itself is allowed to be consumed by the Levi Betuma. There's no Kedusha in Ma'aser Sheni, so we paskin. But from the Ma'aser Rishon, you have to separate Truma's Ma'aser. So not only was Truma separated ideally from a product that's Tohard, Ma'aser Rishon was something that we wanted for it to remain Tohard, for us to have Truma's Ma'aser Betara. What about Ma'aser Sheni? So Ma'aser Sheni is very unique. Ma'aser Sheni on one hand is eaten by the owners. On the other hand, if Ma'aser Sheni becomes Tameh, it may not be eaten. Aber, if Ma'aser Sheni becomes Tameh, there is a solution. What's the solution? Redeem it on money. Take that money to Yerushalmi, and with the money buy chulin that's pure, which will now be invested with the kedusha of Ma'aser Sheni. So unlike Truma's Ma'aser, that if it becomes Tameh, there is no solution, Ma'aser Sheni, there's a solution for it. Nevertheless, ideally, why would you have to redeem it? So Beis Shammai holds that the owner knows not to touch anything only until after the Ma'aser Sheni was designated. By the way, this is way after the Deroichos walk Shesiva Erev. This means everything was pressed. Then he separated normally Truma Gedoyla, V'chulei, Meiser Rishon, and Meiser Sheni. Beis Hillel goes a little bit different. He says no. He says since people are able to solve a Truma with Meiser Sheni by being paid it on money and etc. So therefore, where is the main concern? Truma and Meiser Rishon. But again, it's not like Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan is not following this Beis Hillel. According to Beis Hillel, the owner won't touch it. And no one will do wine tasting. Everyone is aware of there's chaverim, and we want to make sure that it's pitara. Now, Amar Rabbi Yosi, before we go on to other opinions, says the Tana Rabbi Yosi, I want you to know that even though the halacha is like Beis Shammai, which is very unusual, nevertheless, v'harabim lahagu kebeis Hillel. People are, by the way, over here, just to make it clear, lahagu kebeis Hillel means that we're machmir. Beis Shammai is more lenient, just for the record here. No, Beis Shammai is saying that the wine retains its presumed status of tahara for longer. Beis Hillel says it goes away earlier. Rabbi Yosi says that even though the halacha is like Beis Shammai, people are noike Beis Hillel. Now, Amar Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon goes ahead, and it's like a third opinion, but it's like a compromise between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. That nidim divrei Beis Shammai b'shas migdash. What's unique about the times when the temple is standing, guys, remember that nowadays, without the Beis HaMikdash, we are not allowed to eat Meiser Sheni. So, Bizman Beis HaMikdash Kayim, again, even though there's a way out to solve Tuma by Meiser Sheni, but still, people are not looking for a way out. The owner can wait to wine taste another couple of moments. But that's only when there's going to be a consumption of Meiser Sheni. The Nidim, Beis Hillel, Bisman Hazeh, which means prior to the building of the third Beis HaMikdash, that since anyways you can't eat Meiser Sheni, so therefore the presumed status of Tara, the owner's restraint, the other people's restraint that they're not going to go around wildly to do wine tasting when they know that halachically they're going to be metama everything. So we say they didn't even do it. There isn't even a suffix to them. So far we had two opinions. Rab Shimon is like paskening also Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, and now the third opinion is based on the source of Rabbi Yechanan. Not like Beis Shammai, not like Beis Hillel, not like Rab Shimon making this sort of compromise. The moment there is enough wine to be able to remove, now he's adding another detail that we never spoke about. And that is not only Truma, but Trumas Meiser. What does that mean? Aviv, that he removed, there's enough liquid now that we know, winemakers know, that it already represents 3% around, almost 3% of everything that will be extracted from the grapes. Why 3%? 2% Truma Gedoyla. And even though for the designation of Meiser Rishon, you have to really separate 10%. But you can already now put aside one of those 10%. When you will declare that later into Trumas Meiser, you're going to say that 9 of such parts plus this is Meiser Rishon, and this will be the Trumas Meiser for the Meiser Rishon. Don't forget, you are actually not now designating it as Truma or Trumas Meiser. You are physically separating it for it to be later designated as Trumas or Meiser. Gewaldig. And this is, by the way, what Rabbi Yechanan is saying. The moment there was enough liquid to produce 3%, there's 3% of whatever will be from this batch of grapes. Umitamen es haboir. Gewaldig. So now we have a clarity based on what does Rabbi Yechanan make a statement. Now that we're speaking about wine, now that we established also that there was a brayso that spoke about olive oil, even though the Gemara explained that there's a huge difference between wine and oil, oil does not become as tamei as quickly as wine. Nevertheless, here also, don't forget, if the owner is an Ama'aretz, there's going to be contact with the oil. We're speaking about owners who would dafka hire chavedim to be the ones working in the olive press. Here we have different girshois in the brayso. And before we go into reading it inside, I know we just spoke this out. Maybe it was on the previous Masechta, but when it comes to oil production, there are 3 phases. By grapes, there's one, you trample on it. When it comes to oil, there would be first placing the heavy beam on the olives. That will be number one. And some liquid would ooze out. We'll get to that liquid, whether it's halachically oil or not. Then they would take the olives from under the beam, that's step number two, and they would grind it in a millstone. And then they would take back the ground olives to put it again under the beam. These are the three steps. So now, again, we want to know, from when will the owner allow himself to touch his olive oil? Which means, from what point is there a halachic suffix tuma on oil? So some have the girsa in this braisa is tanoi tanei, that misha yetochanu, from when they are ground. From when they are ground means from step number two, prior to step number two. Prior to step number two, for sure the owner didn't touch anything, because prior to step number two, the chaved was unable to separate anything yet, as we'll explain in a moment. The istano yitane in this braisa misha yita'anu, from step number one, from when the olives were put under the beam, before they were ground, like I mentioned, when the beam is on the olive, some oil comes out. From then onwards, the owner allows himself to touch, which means that the separation of what will later become designated truma for the oil was already made. The owner only touches it when the separation was made. Now it says the Gemara, that makes a lot of sense, especially since we learned Rabbi Yechanan, once you have the minimum amount, okay, from when you place it under the beam, step number one, you have a minimum amount of oil, which will be enough oil, let's say the 2 or 3%. But the one that says that the only time you begin to worry about the tumah is only after step number two, is that not against that which Rabbi Yechanan said, which is that when it comes to to winemaking, in other words, the moment you have the minimum amount, the chavedim know to already separate it. Same logic should apply to olive oil. So why, according to the one who's goydus, that only from step number two will the owner touch it? Why? The workers already made that separation. Here again, the Gemara says, you're confusing wine and oil. We already established that. Elakan the yayin, the kan the shemen. Again, the same lashon, the loy hu yayin and hu shemen, are they not the same? Ma bein yayin or ma bein shemen. What's the difference between wine and oil? So here says the Gemara, now I want to add yayin to masa mitzuya, shemen to masa mitzuya. I want to add something very important. And that is, we just learned, the way we learned the Gemara, that by oil there is no presumed consent. So first of all, it's clear that this braisa must be speaking about a case where there is explicit consent, or even shlichus. That's clear. Even when they're shlichus, now that they're shlichus, that's why the Gemara is a kasha. So why wouldn't we presume that the workers who were told to separate it did it the moment step number one happened? Step number one, you place it under the beam, some oil comes out, it represents 3% or more. So here again, we use the logic that yayin to masa mitzuya, shemen ein to masoi mitzuya. First of all, even the owner, people are not into oil tasting that much. Don't forget, guys, if the owner says I touched it, then it's vaday tamei midrabanan to masama aretz. We're speaking about a case where we don't know, and there's no nemanus over here. So the presumption by wine is always, Gabriel, that people like tasting wine. I'm curious, Gabriel, when do you taste the wine? When do you guys begin tasting the wine?
From when it's a grape.
From when it's a grape. But certainly when you're pressing it, right? When the process begins, I don't know, because of the machines?
Well, yes. When you're pressing, you actually really pay a lot of attention to make sure that you're catching you want to get just the good stuff, just the good flavor, and then you cut off the rest.
And you catch that by tasting, or do you need to taste to catch it? Is tasting necessary for that?
It's that's the way it's done for most high-end wine. That's the way it's done. You taste.
There you go. Clear. Beautiful. And oil, it wasn't so necessary. Or daf chavtes amid beis, another answer. Amar Abchia barado. And the reason why he's giving another answer is because when an owner is giving the workers explicit authority to designate oil, that in itself indicates that the owner doesn't want to be restricted with touching his oil. But nevertheless, kan v'kan hatuma mitzuya, even if it's equal, you see, the owner gave permission because he wants to have someone else deal with it for him to be able to taste his oil. But nevertheless, tuma is mitzuya by wine more than by oil, by something else. And there's something else which is important, as the Noisei Kalim say over here, and this is, I know, doesn't sound so hygienic, is that the shratzim enjoy wine a lot more than they enjoy oil. And aside of the chashash that the owner or another person in Amma Aretz did some wine tasting, aside of that, there is a fear that one of the shmoyne shratzim that went into the vat to drink wine drowned in the vat, became a bona fide alcoholic. He drowned in his own drinking, and that sheretz in the bottom of the vat will be matama the whole vat. So b'chlal, by wine, there's more concern. That's why Rabbi Yechanan says by wine, mamish the first second. When it comes to oil, we give you until one other step. Interesting. Now, says the Gemara, let's go further by a Braisa. Tani, we learned in a Braisa another shita. By oil, that Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, that Imratza, if you want, what should you do? Maybe Zaysim, the Noistam Tachas HaMemel, let's understand the memel, says the Marafulda on the top. We're speaking about step number one. Step number one is they put a beam or they put a stone right away in the beginning. Now, putting a stone is, pass the stone around a little bit, means begin to press. That will release a little bit of oil. It's even before it would be readied for it to be moved to step number two, to the millstone. Even before that, he's mamish going back to making it equal to Rabbi Yechanan. The moment you begin to have some juices oozing out of the olives, right away separate that as truma. Now, why didn't the other Chachamim agree with that? So Amru Loi, no, Loi Doimim Zeisim La Novim. That's not correct. Because aside of the issue of Tumah and Tara, you have to know from when is the juice considered wine, from when is the juice considered oil. By grapes, whatever comes out is wine. I know it's not fermented yet, but that is the wine. By olive oil, the little bit of liquid that's coming out without the beam properly being put on top of it. When you're putting a stone, a memel, it's a different stone, and you're having a little bit of pressure, that liquid is not called oil yet. So it's not as soon as possible. It's not as soon. Nothing happened yet. Because because grapes are softer, they allow the liquid that's within them to come out. But zeisim that are difficult, and therefore, at least prior to the end of step number one, where there was a lot of pressure on the olive, the little bit of liquid is nisht liquid. It's not olive oil. It's not halachic olive oil. And that's why they disagreed with the sheet of Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda. Perhaps one of the reasons why by a wedding we say invei hagefen, the invei hagefen, is because what we all want, guys, we have to all get into our premiums. Question is, how much pain do we have to undergo? How much pressure does God Almighty have to put on us for some good, healthy juices to come out? So the Rebbe should best all of us that we should be more like grapes and less like olives. And the little bit of pressure should be enough for us to produce what Hashem wants for us to produce. Okay, moving on to the next halacha. The next halacha has two, the next Mishnah, halacha Gimel, has two different but major rules. And rule number one is regarding the actual separation of truma. And as we mentioned, that not only do you not need to physically separate it, you only have to make an oral designation. And the question will be, how specific do you have to be when you make that oral declaration? In other words, what are the general options? In this keli, I'm making a verbal separation for truma. What will actually be truma? We'll see. When you'll remove it later, let's go with Bereida. That was the truma. Making that declaration already is misaken, the rest from tevel, or do you have to specify at least from what part of the vessel, from what part of the pile a part would meet, from the north or from the south, right? From the right or from the left. Even though when you make a declaration, I'm going to be separate, truma is in the right part of the pile, it's also not exact. But you know what's exact? If I said that it's going to be in the right, I know it's vaday not in the left. So at least there is part of the pile that's not even meduma. That's enough for your oral designation to take hold, halachically. Let's read inside. And again, like we mentioned, it's interesting. There are 4 different opinions. This is the most unspecific type of oral declaration. In other words, you didn't b'chlal give any indication to any particular part of the pile, of the vessel, etc. And also, if you make the same when it comes to meiseres, meiser rishonim or meiser sheni, umasreisa v'toichai, or also when it comes to making the declaration regarding trumas meiser or trumas meiser zeh b'toichai. Now here, let's go with the greatest, most lenient opinion, that even when I'm making a declaration regarding meiser, trumas meiser has to come from the meiser rishon. Even though the meiser rishon was given no specific location, I can still say that from wherever the meiser rishon is, in it, there's going to be trumas meiser separated. I'm separating the trumas meiser. Which not only do you not need to specify where in the meiser rishon will be later the trumas meiser, more than that, even if the meiser rishon itself was not located, because there was no specification by this declaration, it's still going to be valid. That is the most lenient opinion. You never have to specify. You have to declare, in it, there's truma. People can ask, shkoyach, what you didn't know before, in it, it's truma? No. Before you made that declaration, it's teva. The owner has to say that in this, there's truma. In this, there's meiser rishon. And wherever the meiser rishon is, in it, there's trumas meiser. Rab Shimon goes to the other side. Not true. That, I'm sorry. Rab Shimon is the Tanakama. If someone makes such an unspecific declaration, opinion number 1 is Rab Shimon Oimed, Chor Hashem. Chor Hashem means it's valid. It's good. It's a proper designation. No need for clear designation. However, the Chachamim are on the other side of Rab Shimon, and they say, no, that you have to specify how much. Either b'tzvaynoi or b'draymoi. Give some clarity from what section of the pile. And like we explained, even though I'm declaring that truma is in the northern part of the pile, where in the north, I don't know, but at least there's clarity that it's not in the south. So once you're misakin the south, we allow that to extend to all of the rest, obviously, when you remove it. Because you can't take anything from the north, you might be taking the truma. But that statement takes effect. Opinion number 3, Rabbi Elazar Chisma. It's time to know that many times he's called Rabbi Elazar ben Chisma. That was his father's name. However, there's a medrash that says that Chisma means strengthened. And Rabbi Elazar had a difficulty davening for the Amid. And he would get embarrassed because of his inability. And whatever he did, he got strengthened, and he was able to daven. And then the Medrash says, then they said, Rabbi Elazar Chisma, Rabbi Elazar the strong one. They in other words, they were doirish the name of his father as that was his koyach. And what does he say? He says like this, that ha'oimar trumas hakri mimenu alav. When it comes to truma, we allow for you to get away without having any type of specification, without any specific formula. By truma, but not by meiser. And why is that? I'll tell you why. The logic. Because since meiser, Hashem says it has to be exact. And by the way, that includes tumas meiser, exact meaning the amount, the quantity, 10%, or 10% from the 10%. So not only do you have to give an exact amount, but you have to give a specification. Since when it comes to truma, there is no need to be specific in the quantity, So his logic is, from that, me'inyan le'inyan, you don't have to be specific in the location. So he's like a compromise between Rab Shimon and the Chachamim. And now the fourth opinion, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Ha'omer isur meiser zeh, asui trumas meiser olav, karashem. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov agrees with Rab Shimon that you don't need to specify. But there's one exception, and that is that you can't do that double. Double would mean by trumas meiser. Truma, if you made a non-specific declaration for meiser rishon, you don't even know which side of the pile it's coming from. So it's not specified. And then you're saying, and now from the meiser rishon, I'm separating trumas meiser. From where in the meiser rishon? Also no specific location given. That's too much. You can give trumas and meisers are the same, but when you're doing a double, one on top of the other, you can't build something on top of something that was not specific. That's where he will agree with the Chachamim only when it comes to trumas meiser, when the meiser rishon was not specified. And we're going to get back, God willing, tomorrow in the Gemara to go back to all of these four opinions. So that's number one. 4 shitas regarding specific, non-specific designation. Second topic of the Mishnah, a whole different topic. Like we mentioned, that there is a seder that one has to follow when you are giving trumas umaisis. And as the Mishnah itself will be quoting a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, where the pasuk writes that Milei-oscha v'dim'acha lo se'achar. And as we will see, Rashi writes at Chitas, that Milei-oscha means bikurim, and dim'acha means truma. Lo se'achar doesn't only mean literally don't delay it, it means don't go out of order. And when God says don't make bikurim and truma out of order, it doesn't only mean truma and bikurim. It means all of the designations of truma sumaisvis have to follow the order. Now, what is the order? So obviously bikurim should come first. Why? Because bikurim has to be designated even before you harvest. Really, the right way of doing bikurim is when it begins to bud, you already put the gemi, the rubber band, the siman, to remember this one came first. So the designation of the bikurim happens way before you harvested it. All the other trumas u'maisvis, really you're only chayiv after there's a gemar malacha, after they made ruach, right? Even though if you did it b'shibalim post facto, it's okay, but let's go to the ideal. In other words, clearly bikurim comes first. So comes bikurim first. Then from what remains, you separate truma gedolah. Then from what remains, you separate meiser rishon. From the meiser rishon, trumas meiser. And then you separate meiser sheni or meiser ani. So says the Mishnah that hamagdim truma lebikurim. How is it even possible to be magdim truma to bikurim? I'll tell you how. This person forgot to designate bikurim the right way. He should have already put a siman on any one of the shivas haminim that this one is the b'char, bikurim from the first. He didn't do it. Not only that, he harvested the produce. We don't say, "Oh, he missed it, batal karbonai." We don't say that. We don't say that. We say that if you didn't yet separate bikurim, even though it's already after the harvest, even though it's after the gemar malacha, you have to do it right now. So now you're chayiv bikurim and truma, and even now bikurim has to be separated before the truma. And if you were magdim the truma to the bikurim, or if you were magdim the meiser rishon to truma, or if you separated meiser sheni before you separated meiser rishon, so af al pi shuhu oiver b'loy sasei, as the Mishnah will say explicitly, what is the lav? Nevertheless, masha asu asui. Like we mentioned in Babli Tamura in the beginning over there in Daf Hey, when the Gemara speaks about this side that says that Kol Milsa da Amar Rachmana Loy Savit. When God says don't do something, it doesn't mean that if you did it, it's ineffective. Sometimes it's effective. It's sin, but it's effective. This is one of the examples. I Avad Mahani. I want to add something to the I Avad Mahani, just to make that clear. If you separated out of order, once the Meruah happened, for Aviv, I separated meiser rishon. Can the Levi eat that? No. What does the Levi normally have to do? Separate trumas meiser. There's something else that he has to separate. He has to separate from his meiser rishon the percent that should have been truma. and then separate Meiser, Trumas Meiser. It's very important. I'm going to say it, I know it's late, but just quickly. If the owner separated Trumas or Meisers before the Meruach, if you separate the tithings, Bishibalim, when the things were still in stalks, they were not yet completed. If the owner wrongfully separated Meiser Rishon before Truma, then the Levi doesn't have to separate Truma, only the Trumas Meiser. Our Mishnah is speaking about all scenarios, just to make it clear that even though it says Masha Asui Asui, what that means is that we don't say that his declaration is B'chlal nothing. Everything is tevel the way it used to be. No, everything is Mesukin. But still, modifications will have to happen. The same thing also is that the Meiser Sheni Chelek has to have from it removed Meiser Rishon. Okay. But still, Masha Asui Asui. And what's the source? Shenemar, as it says, Meliyoscha v'dimacha. Meliyoscha means your fullness offering, which is a reference to the Bikurim. V'dimacha, that which can create meduma, which is truma. Lo yisa'acha means don't go out of order. Now, uminayin, how do you know that this is the right order? The Mishnah is asking. Uminayin sheiknu habikurim lo truma. And the Mishnah is asking why we have a question. When you look inside the psukim in the Torah at times calls bikurim truma. The Torah uses the word reishis when it comes to bikurim. It's both called truma and it's called reishis. When the Torah is referring to truma, it's also called truma and called reishis. In other words, the Mishnah is asking, maybe they should be equal. I know that technically, when you do things properly, you will end up separating bikurim before truma, because bikurim should be separated before the harvest. I know that, but if you did not do it then, now you harvested, now you made the miruach, now I didn't separate bikurim. Now they're both in front of you. How do you know? Asks the Mishnah that you have to do truma before bikurim. The question is, truma v'reishis. Look inside the marafulda, the last narrow line going into under the Gemara. Kori truma v'reishis. Bikurim is called truma. The Amar Mar the Trumas Yodecha, that pasuk goes to Bikurim. And it's also called Reishis Bikuri Admask. Marafulda. Truma is also called Truma, and Reishis the Gancha. Right? Okay, so Bekitzer, you have these names by everything. Kori Truma Vereishis answers the Mishnah Ella Yigdemu Bikurim. Why should Bikurim come first? Because the word Bikurim, this week's Parsha, B'char, the word bikurim means the first. Or because since the chiyuv was chal first, the chiyuv of bikurim is when the first begins to get ready, really when it begins to bud. So if the obligation came first vis-a-vis bikurim, it's only logical that you should do the bikurim before the truma. The truma it has to become before Meiser. I'll tell you why. Because Truma, not only is it called Truma, so what? Meiser is called Meiser. The point is that Truma is called Rishoin, like we just quoted in the Manafulda. Reish is the Gancha. The Torah never uses the words the first when it comes to Meiser Rishoin. Well, the first means first. The Truma should come right before Rishon means Meiser Rishoin, because Truma is called first and Meiser Rishoin is not called first. Meiser Rishon should come before Sheni. Why? Because since in the Meiser Rishon there is Trumas Meiser and Trumas called Reishis, only logical. Since Yesh by Reishis, it should come before Meiser Sheni. But again, nevertheless, if you went out of the order, you violated the law. But Ma Sha'asui Asui. We'll leave it at that, and a lot more, God willing, to be continued tomorrow, live in Shul, God willing. Shkoyach. Slichas finished early.